Well, today we are in part 4 of our Explore God series, where we're joining with churches all across Chicagoland, exploring 7 big questions of faith. And if you've missed any of it so far, maybe you're just jumping in today, you can view all the previous messages online. You can even share one with a friend as a way to invite someone to engage with us in this series. You can also stay after worship today to join in our Explore God education hour with discussion groups. We hope that you will live deeply into this series as we all together ask these big questions. Speaking of big questions, today is a big question for many, both within and beyond the Christian faith. Is Christianity too narrow? All right, by a show of hands, how many people took a religion class in school, at any level of school? How many people took a religion class? A lot of you took a religion class. It's good to see. In fact, it was my junior year of college when I took a world religions class. It was a survey class where we looked at all of the major religions, both current and historical. But it was more than that, because our final exam was an experiential one where we needed to go and to explore a religion different from our own. Now, this was interesting timing, because while I was in this class, I was also going through my own personal spiritual journey, asking these kind of big questions of faith. Having grown up in the church, I wanted to see what else was out there. And so I got to do it firsthand. I chose as my other religion to meet with and attend a Buddhist meditation group. And so on a Thursday evening, I met this group, and we sat still for 50 minutes in silent meditation. That was one of the hardest things I think I've ever done, to be still and to be silent for that long. At one point, we actually stood up and did some walking meditation outside, with our heads down and our hands kind of together like this. And I started to think, is anyone going to see me? This seems very odd and strange. And it was. I mean, there were a lot of beautiful things to appreciate about this different way of approaching spirituality. But as a newcomer, I certainly felt a little bit out of place. I didn't know what to expect. Some of it seemed kind of odd and strange to me. But the reality is, as people try to connect with God, as we try from a temporal perspective to connect to the eternal, as we try to compare what is seen to what is unseen, there are probably going to be some unusual ways of approaching it. And Christianity is no different. Can you imagine a newcomer coming to our church, coming to a Bible study or a small group, someone who has never been exposed to our faith? Can you imagine what they might think? Let's take prayer, for example, okay? Let's imagine that we're inviting someone into a prayer circle with us as we're going to pray for ourselves, for our community, for the world. And we're going to tell this person, okay, first thing you're going to do is you're going to hold hands with the person next to you. And the next thing you're going to do is you're going to close your eyes. Can you imagine what this person might be thinking? Maybe you've been in a prayer circle where everyone was invited to pray as they felt led. What would someone who has never heard that, how would they make sense of that comment? Praying as you feel led might go something like this. Okay, I'm going to open us up in prayer. Kyle, would you close us in prayer? And everyone else, pray as you feel led. The Christian author and comedian John Acuff talks about different types of people that you might run into in these kind of prayer circles. He talks about the almoster. The almoster is someone who almost works up the courage to pray out loud in this prayer circle. In fact, just as you're about to pray, you can feel the almoster about to begin a sentence or a prayer, but then they back away. They're almost about to pray. You can feel their energy, and you can feel them about to offer this prayer, and then nothing happens. You might also, as Acuff reflects, run into the gunslinger. That is when you and maybe someone else are the last in this prayer circle to have prayed. Everyone else has prayed, and it's a duel. Who is going to go next? How do you time it right? You don't want to speak when they're speaking. You don't want to cut the other person off. And you get into a little bit of a mental or a prayerful duel. And one of the others that Acuff talks about is the rambler. Okay, I don't know if you're a rambler kind of in your prayer life. Sometimes I have been accused of being a bit of a rambler. But a rambler is someone who uses this pray as you feel led moment as a kind of an open mic opportunity, maybe to share some of the spiritual insights that they've gained over the last month. And a rambler can only really be stopped by someone close to them, maybe their partner or their wife or their husband, where you can gently squeeze the rambler's hand, and with that squeeze communicate, "I love you, but now is not the moment to share all of your deep insights from the book of Joel that you discovered this past week. Now is not the time." The truth is, there can be some unusual practices, right, that we have in Christianity, especially to those who might be non-religious or even to those who may have never been exposed to our particular faith. We can all think about ways that we try to connect with God. Now, the problem can be when those attempts are based more on us than genuine outreach, than a genuine desire to connect with God. Are they manufactured simply by humanity, simply by our desire for something more, or are they true and authentic attempts to connect with God? This isn't a new concept or a new struggle. In fact, we read about this in the scriptures. The Apostle Paul, encountered this on his missionary journeys. And we're going to read about one encounter in particular this morning. You see, Paul, on these journeys, had just been in Thessalonica, in Berea, and he landed in Athens. He was awaiting his ministry companions, Timothy and Silas, and he was planning to go to Corinth next, but Paul decided while he was there, he might as well use this opportunity to engage the Athenians. Let me show you an image of the ancient city of Athens. Maybe some of you have been there. Maybe some of you have seen pictures before. Athens at this point in time was no longer, in Paul's time, was no longer the political center of Greece, but it was still a profoundly important place. It was still the academic center of the world. It had been home to the great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. It was a place where ideas were freely exchanged. It was an educated and a cultured environment, and this is what Paul entered as he explored with them their faith and his faith. And so we're going to read together from the story of Paul engaging the Athenians. We're going to look at chapter 17. We're going to read a good portion of Acts chapter 17 together, and we're going to learn and discover more about what Paul encountered. So in verse 16, we're going to begin there, and it says this: "While Paul waited for them in Athens, his ministry companions, that is, he was deeply distressed to find that the city was flooded with idols. He began to interact with the Jews and Gentile God worshippers in the synagogue. He also addressed whoever happened to be in the marketplace each day. Certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers engaged him in discussion too. Some said, 'What an amateur! What's he trying to say?' Others remarked, 'He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods.' They said this because he was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him into custody and brought him to the council on Mars hill. What is this new teaching? Can we learn what you are talking about? You've told us some strange things, and we want to know what they mean. They said this because all Athenians, as well as the foreigners who live in Athens, used to spend their time doing nothing but talking about or listening to the newest thing. Paul, like any tourist, was probably impressed with the grandeur of Athens, but simultaneously depressed to see all of the idols and all of this worship that was taking place around him. Despite the impressive art and architecture that he saw, he realized that none of it really honored God. So he asked questions and he reflected. And as we read in the text, we know that there are Epicureans there. Now, Epicureans were the philosophers that believed that pleasure was the chief end of life. Everything was about experiencing pleasure. And there were also Stoics, and the Stoics' way of life valued morality above all. Neither of them were atheists, but they didn't feel that God really had anything to do with the daily life of a person. And in fact, the Stoics believed further that there was really no destiny or purpose to the life of a human being. What it is about Paul's message that allows him this entry to speak into their culture was really the novelty of it. They had really never heard this message or this good news or this exciting message before, but it was novel to them, and so they invited him to the Areopagus. That's what Mars Hill refers to. It was this hill where court cases were often heard, where new thoughts were often delivered, and it was this place that Paul spoke to them, and he begins a sermon, and that's what we're going to read next, starting in verse 22. It says this: Paul stood up in the middle of the council on Mars Hill and said, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through town and carefully observing your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription: to an unknown God. What you worship as unknown, I now proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, is a Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in the temples made with human hands, nor is God served by human hands as though he needed something, since he is the one who gives life, breath, and everything else. From one person, God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. God made the nations so they would seek him, perhaps even reach out to him and find him. In fact, God isn't far away from any of us. In God, we live, move, and exist. As some of your own poets said, we are his offspring. Unlike Paul would have done in other settings, he didn't begin with Scripture. He didn't start his sermon with the Bible. Instead, he makes a general reference to religion. He actually compliments them or commends them, the Athenians, on their search, on their desiring for something more. But behind this remark is the truth that religion itself doesn't always lead us to God. Sometimes we can be going through the motions without really seeking the one to whom the motions are directed. Paul now reveals the identity of this unknown God. That's an interesting concept, right? This unknown God. How might have this come about? Well, about 600 years before Paul, there was a man named Epimenides. Say that a few times fast, you'll catch yourself. This man named Epimenides, as a plague had broken out in Athens, he decided to release a flock of sheep throughout the city. And wherever one of the sheep would sit, they would sacrifice that sheep to the god that had the nearest shrine or temple. But if a sheep sat in a place where there was no shrine and there was no temple, they would sacrifice that sheep to an unknown god. This unknown god was kind of a catch-all. It was meant to serve the purpose of honoring any god that they might have missed as they offered their sacrifices and their worship to all the gods in this pantheistic tradition. God is proclaimed by Paul, the capital G God, the God who created the world and the universe and everything we know. And this God, as Paul points out, is bigger than any temple, than any place of worship, bigger than anything that can be represented by human hands. This God is greater than the creation itself. And Paul connects to their searching and their yearning and points out that because we are the offspring of this God, as he quotes the Greek philosopher, because we are God's offspring, that is why we search. That is why we explore. And Paul reveals the truth of his faith to them. Closes his sermon in the last couple verses here, verses 29 through 31. He says this, "Therefore, as God's offspring, we have no need to imagine that the divine being is like a gold or silver or stone image made by human skill and thought. God overlooks ignorance of these things in times past, but now directs everyone everywhere to change their hearts and lives. This is because God has set a day when he intends to judge the world justly by a man he has appointed. God has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." Paul is saying this message that as God's children, as God's offspring, we have a responsibility to have right ideas about God, about our Creator in this search. Even as we search from the unknown God to the God that can be known and be revealed. It's not a God of silver, of gold, or of stone. Paul encourages these Athenians to have accountability in their faith, not simply saying, as they shrug their shoulders, well, we just don't know. Paul is communicating to them that they can know a God revealed to them by a man as he proclaims the gospel. And as he begins to talk about Jesus and doesn't have a chance to say much before he's cut off, the one image that he leaves with them is of Jesus as judge, right? Is that how you would start a conversation as you were talking about the meaning of your faith? Probably not. We probably wouldn't start with Jesus as judge. He would have wanted to tell them more. But he had to speak the big truth in the time that he was allowed. He closes with the resurrection because that makes everything possible. That is, in many ways, the proof of his argument in this testimony. Nothing makes sense without the resurrection. Paul, in this moment, in a place where people are in some ways being hostile to his faith, asks questions, compliments their search, and then with a gentleness, with a reverence and a respect, boldly but humbly proclaims his faith. The bottom line, I think, that we can take away from Paul's message is this. Religion is not simply the point. Religion, in many ways, is our attempt to reach God. But Christianity is God's attempt to reach us. What about you? Are you simply practicing a religion, or are you fostering a relationship? Are you comfortable exploring the religious ins and outs of faith? Or is there something that you're searching for? Because as I think we can see through Jesus' life and ministry, it wasn't about religion. It was about relationship. A relationship with you, with me, with all of us. It's my hope and prayer that we would be a community that is so winsome that it catches the attention of our community. That we wouldn't do things simply to draw attention to ourselves, but by the way that we carry ourselves, people would take notice and maybe even ask questions. In fact, I pray that we're bombarded with questions to talk about why we do what we do, why we spend time with who we do, and why we go where we go. That we might get asked questions like, why do you serve those in need here in Wheaton and in downtown Chicago? Why do you send a group of high school students to Guatemala? Why do you support a family that is in need of transitional housing? And I pray that in those moments, we would, with gentleness and respect, with boldness and with humility, be able to articulate our faith in meaningful ways. To share our experiences and what motivates us to do what we do as followers of Jesus. This God about which Paul spoke offers peace to all. This isn't a narrow invitation. In fact, this is a very broad invitation. This is not exclusive, but this is inclusive. And I hope as we engage those around us and as we spend time not only in our own Bible studies and small groups, but with others that we interact with in our workplaces and in the community, that people would see and notice by our lives that we worship a God that is embracing, a God that isn't simply narrow, but that offers a grand invitation, a wide invitation to know a personal God through Christ. I think the truth of reflecting on this question is that in many forms, religion is an attempt to reach God. In Christianity, we believe that it's God reaching us. One of the unique things about our faith and about Jesus is that we don't sacrifice to get to him, but he sacrificed to get to us. Amen.